Hey Waiter by Robert Benchley. Published in the Benchley Roundup, first published 1954. Mr. Peters usually had his lunch sent into his office, since it consisted of a glass of milk and perhaps a wisp of chicken. It seemed hardly worth while to check one's coat and hat at a restaurant for just that, to say nothing of unfolding a napkin and telling a waiter about it. And besides, Mr. Peters was still a little self-conscious in restaurants. Something left over from his boyhood still haunted him with the feeling that he had got into the wrong dining room. For in spite of his long list of murder victims, Mr. Peters was at heart a timid and retiring citizen. On certain occasions, however, he had to go out to lunch, as for instance when some out-of-town representative wanted to talk business. Out-of-town representatives can always talk business better when munching on a roll, and tablecloths are notoriously better scratch-pads than office stationery, probably because they cannot be saved and held against the scratcher. So on this particular day, you have no reason to know on what particular day yet, but you will have in just a minute, Mr. Peters found himself headed for the Belvedere Grill with Mr. Hertz of the Old Town Drop Forge and Tool Company to settle several unimportant things over a curry of lamb. Mr. Hertz was no stranger to Mr. Peters, but he was not what you would call a crony. He was a rather disagreeable man, who always wore a stiff white shirt and a bow tie with a bat-wing collar, having decided early in his business career that an important man should always dress in an important manner. In fact, his dress was one of the few ways that Mr. Hertz had of showing that he was an important man. His dress and his attitude toward his underlings. In his attitude toward underlings, he acted as Mussolini looks. Come to think of it, when Mussolini is not dressed up, he also seems to be wearing a stiff white shirt and a batwing collar. This is probably just a coincidence. As they checked their hats and coats, Mr. Hertz began his campaign to show the employees of the establishment that he was not going to be imposed on. "Hang that coat somewhere where you can find it now," he said to the girl. "I don't want to have to stand around all night waiting when I come out." And then he added to Mr. Peters, "You have to watch these girls. They're a dumb bunch." The girl, who was a friend of Mr. Peters, said she would do her best to put the coat where she could remember it. Mr. Peters slipped her a wink and a quarter in advance. It wouldn't be such a great loss, he thought to himself, if Mr. Hertz did lose that coat. It was like something you take along on a camping trip in case the nights get cold. The head waiter, who was also a friend of Mr. Peters, led them to a table by the window, usually considered a choice location by those who like to see what they are eating, especially if it is bluefish. But Mr. Hertz took it as a personal affront. "What are you trying to do, freeze us to death?" he growled at the head waiter. His tone implied that the man was a member of a gang in conspiracy to get this guy Hertz at any cost. He even went to the window and examined the casing. "There's a draft in here that would blow you out of your chair," he said. "Give us another table." "Why, I thought," began the head waiter. "Never mind what you thought," snapped Mr. Hertz. "It's what I think. I'm paying for this lunch." And he picked out a table that pleased him better and sat down. It happened to be a table whose occupants had just left. "And get some of this stuff cleared off, too," he said, adding sarcastically, "unless you are just being paid to wear a dress suit in the daytime." Mr. Peters laughed apologetically, trying to make the head waiter think that Mr. Hertz was just an old joker. The head waiter laughed too, but without spirit. Mr. Hertz didn't laugh at all. "These captains think they own the world," he said to Mr. Peters. "They'd kill you if they could." And Mr. Peters thought that maybe that wasn't a bad idea. "Now let's see," muttered Mr. Hertz, picking up the menu and turning to the waiter who stood by. "What's here that's fit to eat? Anything?" "The chicken hash is very nice today, sir," said the waiter. "You would suggest that," snapped Mr. Hertz. I never sat down at a table that the waiter didn't try to make me take the chicken hash. What do you get, a rake-off on all the chicken hash you sell?" The waiter smiled uneasily. "Good night," said Mr. Hertz. "What a layout! Why don't you have something that people can eat once in a while? What's that you've got on your shirt front? That looks good." The waiter looked in embarrassed fashion at his shirt front, but couldn't think up a good answer. There was a spot there, but he didn't know what it was, so he said nothing. "A surly boy, eh?" said Mr. Hertz. "Well, that takes a quarter off your tip." And then, with a knowing nod to Mr. Peters, "That's the only language these wops understand." "Eric is a Swede, aren't you, Eric?" asked Mr. Peters, with forced geniality, trying to get the conversation out of its nasty tone. "Swedes are the worst of all," said Mr. Hertz. "Well, Swede, have you got any mussels?" "Not at this time of year," said the waiter. "The clams are very good, sir." "Oh, not this time of year, eh? Well, that's the first time I ever knew that mussels had to have a certain time of year. What do they do, just come out in the summer? Why don't you just say that you haven't got 'em? Nobody asked you their habits." "I'll have some chicken hash," put in Mr. Peters. He really didn't want it, but he wanted to do something to discredit Mr. Hertz. "Well, you're easier than I am," said Mr. Hertz. "I can't eat any of this truck on here. Broil me a small steak and make it snappy, and have it well done on the edges, too. Don't bring it to me half-cooked." "Any potatoes, sir?" asked the waiter, in evident relief that the first stage of the ordeal was over. "I said potatoes. Are you deaf? Hashed-in-cream potatoes. Do you want me to write it out for you? And some new peas, too, if you think you can remember that." The waiter disappeared, perspiring from every pore. "These waiters give me a pain in the eye," said Mr. Hertz. "They never listen, and then when they get out in the kitchen, they match to see what they'll bring you. In my traveling around the country, I've found that the only way is to treat 'em rough if you want to get any service at all." "That's one way," replied Mr. Peters, snapping a piece of roll at the salt-cellar. Mr. Hertz drew out of his pocket a neat packet of letters, from which he extracted one. It proved to be something written in connection with the Old Town Drop Forge and Tool Company, and it interested Mr. Peters only slightly more than it would interest you if I were to tell you about it. Mr. Peters would not have been interested in the private correspondence of Lucretia Borgia if offered to him by Mr. Hertz. In fact, Mr. Hertz was in a precarious position, if he only knew it. A detailed resume of this document consumed perhaps 4 minutes, at the end of which Mr. Hertz looked around the room and then banged heavily on the table, frightening Mr. Peters out of his rather sinister musings, and attracting the attention of the head waiter. "Come here!" he shouted. The head waiter came over. "What are they doing, fishing for that food out in the river? We've been waiting half an hour." "I'm sorry, sir," said the head waiter. "You ordered something that took a little extra time to prepare. I'll see where it is." "Extra time? How long does it take you to put a steak on the fire and broil it? It's been 3/4 of an hour now. I could slap a cow to death and get a steak out of it in the time you've taken." Unfortunately, the waiter put in an appearance at this moment, bearing Mr. Peters' chicken hash. "Well, here you are," snarled Mr. Hertz. "What do you do out there in the kitchen? Play chess?" "I'm sorry, sir," said the waiter. "Your steak took a few minutes." "You're sorry? What do you think I am? I'm hungry. My God, I've seen rotten service in my time, but never anything that could beat this. Where's my steak?" "I'm getting it right now, sir," said the waiter. Mr. Hertz's voice was now raised to a pitch in which most men speak over a long-distance telephone. "Where's the manager?" he bellowed. "I've stood all of this. I'm going to." And he pushed his chair back, like a man about to go and look for a manager. Now, as any friend of Mr. Peters knows, there is one thing which upsets him probably more than anything else, and that is to be made conspicuous in a public place. And Mr. Hertz was rapidly attaining a conspicuousness usually reserved for men with sidewalk fits. As he turned to project his venom more fully on the members of the restaurant staff, Mr. Peters reached over and dropped something into his glass. and Mr. Hertz, to refresh himself after his tirade, immediately obliged by drinking it. The waiter came rushing up with the steak, but Mr. Peters was alone at the table. "The gentleman has left the room, Eric," he said. "I don't think he'll be back for his steak. I'll take the check, and here's something for yourself." And, taking one more bite of his chicken hash, Mr. Peters put his napkin on the table and walked out. As he passed through the anteroom, he sensed a commotion in the gentleman's lavatory. But as 2 hospital attendants seemed to be headed in that direction, he decided to go back to his office. "You can give Mr. Hertz's overcoat to some good horse," he said to the coat-room girl as he passed. "He won't need it where he's going." Thank you for listening, and liking and commenting and subscribing and such activities.